So as usual, guys, I was spending a lot of this weekend going up and down this beautiful county that we call Yorkshire, travelling up and down for several different things. It's bonfire night weekend here in the UK, so seeing friends, seeing family, it's the usual kind of stuff, really. And while I was travelling up and down, I was going on mainly the M1 and the M62, two of the busiest motorways in the UK. I was kind of just thinking to myself, wait, why is there a 70-mile-an-hour speed limit on the motorways in the UK? Why is this the case? I mean, I often get these kind of thoughts when I'm travelling around, just ideas for videos. Came up with a few literally at the weekend while travelling around and wrote them down. I'll do videos on them, and this is the first one of those. Now, the long and the short answer of this is because the motorways do adhere to the national speed limit, which for roads that have more than one lane in the UK is in fact 70 miles an hour. For those that have one lane, it is 60 miles an hour. So when you see this sign, which I'm going to put in the edit just now, that means you're going onto a national speed limit road, which again for single lane roads is 60 miles an hour, and for motorways and for roads that have more than one lane, it is in fact 70 miles an hour. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this in terms of how the speed limit can vary. We have things like smart motorways and temporary speed limits on the motorway. Up until recently, there was a really huge 50-mile-an-hour zone on the M1, and thank God that is gone now. They've finally done all the work they've been promising to do, so that's back to 70 miles an hour. That saves me about 10 minutes on my trip down to Sheffield whenever I go. But in all seriousness, that's the general kind of rule of thumb. But then the question really should be, why is it 70 miles an hour? Why is it 70 miles an hour on motorways? And has it always been the case? Well, the simple answer is no, it's not always been the case. And there was actually a period when the motorways were first being built in the UK where they had no speed limit. Let me just repeat that. There was a time when the UK's motorways had no speed limits whatsoever. None. You can go as fast as you want on them. So all those incredible tales about things like the German autobahns, where there are sections of that to this day that do not have any speed limits on. I believe those sections are pretty small compared to the whole road network, but they still do exist. Apparently, any Germans that are watching this, please do let me know, just to be sure on that one. But I believe it's the case that there are still some sections that have no speed limits. That was the whole case for the whole the whole motorway network in the UK. Let's have a look at the history of this, because I actually think this is a really interesting tale, and I did genuinely learn a few things from this article. I'm not going to put the article on the screen just because I want to credit it because it's what I use for a lot of my research here. But an article from historyhit.com, really enjoy their videos on YouTube. But yeah, the speed limit in the UK was initially set in urban areas for motor vehicles at between 2 and 4 miles an hour. Yes, 2 and 4, not 20, not 20. 2. This just shows how slow cars were back then. I mean, 1865 is apparently when that was first put in place, which is before the invention of the motor car. I think all cars back then would have been steam powered before Carl Benz came up with his, was it Mark 1? I think the first car, and you can drive it in Gran Turismo 7, which is an excellent game, of course. But yeah, that just shows you how slow these vehicles were back then. They were literally walking pace in a lot of examples like that. But by 1903, cars started to get more powerful, they could go faster, and the speed limit then was set at around 20 miles an hour, again just for built-up areas. There was no speed limit at all in the rural roads that connected towns and cities. There was no enforcement of that because, well, people rarely used them to drive between cities back then. It was usually just for people going around in the cities. But then in 1930, the British government, in all of its wisdom, decided, you know what, speed limits, don't need them. Don't need them. Let's get rid of them for a bit. So they got rid of them, and shockingly, accidents and incidents on the roads, deaths, casualties, any kind of injuries, they all skyrocketed. So then they decided, you know what? Maybe that's not a good idea. Maybe we should have a new speed limit, and they set it at 30 miles an hour for urban areas, which is in place for most of the UK to this day, unless you're in Wales where it's actually 20 miles an hour these days, I think, which I don't know if they've reversed now, I'm not sure, but I know that was a really, really unpopular decision when they made it in Wales. I think it was last year they made that decision, but I don't know if they've gone back on it since. But then things started to change eventually. We eventually got more powerful and better cars. Cars were becoming more and more popular in the UK, used to basically travel up and down the country, so we needed the roads to be able to do it. So the motorways started to come in. And in fact, the first motorway in the UK was not the M1. I thought it was, I used to think it was, but it was actually the Preston Bypass, which today makes up part of the M6 up in the northwest of the UK. That was back in 1958. And any kind of motorway that was constructed after that all of them, including the Preston bypass, had no speed limit. There was no speed limit at all. Now, back then, this wasn't so much of a problem. Anybody who's driven any cars that are from the 1960s or the 1950s will know they're not exactly quick. I've never had the pleasure personally. I'd love to be given the opportunity to do so, but I'd never be able to drive them as fast as what people were probably trying to do down the motorways in those days. 70 miles an hour, doing 70 miles an hour in those days would have seemed incredibly quick. But eventually cars did start to get more powerful, and some people did actually highlight how fast you could go on the motorways. Now, a certain group from AC Cars met at somewhere called the Blue Boar Services in the Watford Gap on the M1, and they basically tested some cars that they were going to drive at Le Mans, the 24-hour race in France. And they managed to get up to a absolutely biblical 185 miles an hour, highlighting how quick you could go on these roads, because the M1 of course goes for 150 miles if not more. It's a long road, and they managed to get up to an incredible speed doing that. The police actually spotted them doing this, but they couldn't do anything about it because they were not breaking any laws. They were still driving safely. In fact, some policemen actually just came up just to admire the car after it stopped back at the services after they'd done the test. That shows you really what was going on with that. So eventually in 1965 they put in a temporary 4-month, what was meant to be a temporary 4-month 70 mile an hour speed limit to see how it went on the motorways, and eventually the British government decided, no, we're going to make this permanent. 70 mile an hour is going to be the speed limit for the actual the roads here in the actual motorways here in the UK. Now, of course, there are some people that do think that these speed limits are wrong and we shouldn't have any. Now, personally, I absolutely think we should have speed limits in the UK. I mean, there is the argument that says, oh, well, people just break them anyway, why have the speed limits if everybody's going to break them anyway? And I respectfully disagree with that, because I feel like they'd break them even more. They'd go even faster. They'd go even more dangerous, and more people would be, and the accidents would also rise as a result. That's what I personally believe. Now, there is an argument, and I do subscribe to this, to be honest with you. I do think that actually having a higher speed limit in certain areas of the UK's motorways, maybe not everywhere. I don't think having more than 70 miles an hour on the M62, for example, where there is an untold amount of accidents. I don't think having more than 70 miles an hour on, example, the M25, where it's very rarely 70 miles an hour. You actually go on that because it's so busy. But in certain sections, the M1, maybe some quieter motorways, maybe some quieter stretches of motorways, you'd be able to actually go faster. In fact, in a lot of Europe, the speed limit for motorways in generally most European countries is around 130 kilometers an hour, which is about 80 miles an hour. And there are some countries that go even faster than that. Poland, for example, they go up to 140 kilometers an hour, which is about 85. Again, it's different circumstances. Poland's a very big country. It's got lots of the country that's quite empty, and it takes longer to travel between cities, basically. So I understand why. The UK is a lot more densely populated, and we have a lot more traffic on the road as well. So I do get the kind of arguments for it. But at the end of the day, there is still somewhere, believe it or not, in the UK that has no speed limit. Just a quick fact for you guys. Well, I say part of the UK. Technically, it is a crown dependency, but it is part of the British Isles, as it were. It's located between England and Ireland. It's the Isle of Man. There is no speed limit on the Isle of Man outside of the main cities. I think Douglas, which is the main city in the actual island, that's the only part of the country that has speed limits. Everywhere else, you can go as fast as you want. That 30 speed limit only applies to urban areas, which there's not many on the Isle of Man because it's a relatively small island. So most of the country, you can just go as fast as you want. So there is still somewhere in the UK or in the United, I don't know how you describe it. It's part of the British Isles, but it's not part of the UK. It's a crown dependency, I believe that is the term. So anyway, part of this part of the world's indirectly governed by the UK. I think that's the easiest way to probably put it, but there is still somewhere you can do that. But motorway speed limits in the UK have been 70 miles an hour ever since the mid-60s, and they're not going to change. And I don't think they'll ever increase them personally, but I'd like to see them try. I'd like to see them do some research and give it a go. But let us know what you think about this in the comments below, guys. Should we get rid of speed limits on the motorway in the UK? Go back to the good old days. Should we increase the speed limit, or are you happy at 70 miles an hour? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And of course, keep it subscribed, like, share, comment, everything in between here on the motoringchronicle.com to see much more motoring and motorsport content just like this.